There is a specific moment that happens in certain concerts that I have never heard anyone describe accurately, possibly because the people it happens to are not the kind of people who write about concerts afterward. The band is loud, not loud the way a car alarm is loud, but loud the way a wall is solid, the way pressure is physical, and somewhere in the middle of the set, the music stops being something you are listening to and becomes something you are inside. The room disappears. The distinction between your body and the sound disappears. And what replaces it is not joy, not sadness, not any of the emotions that music is supposed to produce. It is something closer to what you feel standing at the edge of a very high place, looking down, knowing absolutely that you will not jump, and feeling, underneath the certainty, something that is not quite the opposite of wanting to. That moment is what I keep returning to when I try to understand what heavy metal did with H.P. Lovecraft. Because the obvious answer? That monstrous gods and heavy guitars go together the way skulls go with leather jackets, that it is all aesthetic coherence, visual grammar, the iconography of transgression, does not explain why the music keeps working decades later, why the cosmology of a failed writer from Providence who died in poverty in 1937 is still generating albums, still filling rooms, still producing that moment. Aesthetic coherence wears out. Lovecraft in metal has not worn out. Something else is happening. Lovecraft's central philosophical claim is this: the universe is not structured around human experience, was not made with human minds as its intended audience, and the entities that actually populate it at the scales that matter, temporal, spatial, ontological, are not evil in any sense that presupposes a moral relationship with us. They simply are, the way geology simply is, and our existence registers on them the way a particular arrangement of sand registers on the tide. The horror in his stories is never really the monster. It is the moment the protagonist realizes that the monster does not know the protagonist exists. That incomprehension, that asymmetry, is the true terror. You cannot fight indifference. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot even be its enemy. This is not a new idea philosophically. Versions of it appear in Epicurus, in certain strands of Buddhist thought that resist teleology, in the scientific materialism of the 19th century that replaced a universe governed by providence with one governed by entropy and probability. What Lovecraft did was give it sensory texture. He made indifference feel like something, like cold water rising in a room with no exits, like geometry that should not be possible, like a sound whose source you cannot locate and whose frequency seems to be inside the architecture of your thinking rather than outside it. Heavy metal, in its more interesting forms, has been trying to make the same translation since at least the early 1980s, not to argue for cosmic indifference, not to illustrate it with characters and plot, but to make it a physical experience that happens to the body before the mind has time to process it. The doom metal of early Cathedral, or the Cathedral-adjacent bands that proliferated in the British underground of the late 80s, did something specific with tempo that I think gets under-theorized. They slowed the riff down past the point where it could be followed cognitively, and into the range where it becomes environmental. You stop tracking the music as a sequence of events and start experiencing it as a condition, a state, rather than a narrative. The Lovecraftian entity in those records is not described. It is present. But here is where I get stuck, and where I want to stay for a moment rather than move past it too quickly. Why is this pleasurable? That is the question that neither music criticism nor philosophy has answered in a way that satisfies me. Because it is pleasurable, unambiguously, consistently, for enough people across enough different cultural contexts to make the specific explanation less convincing. It is not pleasurable the way a comfortable chair is pleasurable. It is pleasurable the way the very high place is pleasurable, which is to say it is pleasurable and frightening simultaneously, in proportions that vary by person and moment, and cannot be fully separated from each other. The fear does not cancel the draw. In some configurations, the fear is the draw. Edmund Burke wrote about this in 1757, in a way that still seems more accurate to me than most of what came after it. He separated the beautiful from the sublime on the axis of safety. The beautiful is what we approach. The sublime is what we retreat from while looking at. The sublime is the pleasure of terror at a distance sufficient to survive it. A storm at sea from the shore. A cliff from back from the edge. The thing that would kill you, in a context where it cannot. Metal with Lovecraftian cosmology is, structurally, Burke's sublime built into a listening experience, the indifferent cosmos, the vast scale, the entity that does not register your existence. All of it is real as philosophical content, real as the conceptual architecture the music is built on, but it is experienced from a seat, or on a floor, or through headphones, with an exit available, with the knowledge that you chose to be here and can choose to leave. The terror is genuine, and the distance is genuine, and the experience lives in the gap between them. What I cannot fully account for is why some people want more distance and some want less. Because the listening spectrum in heavy metal, the range from melodic death metal to the most extreme forms of black or drone doom, maps fairly cleanly onto a spectrum of how much protection you want between yourself and the abyss the music opens. Melodic death metal gives you the cosmology wrapped in hooks that your brain can hold onto, rhythmic landmarks, choruses that return. The most extreme drone doom gives you almost nothing to hold on to. No clear meter, no return, no structure you can use to locate yourself in the piece. Just descent. The abyss is not depicted. You are in it, and there is no indicated way out. And the question of whether you find this terrifying or liberating appears to be a question about something fairly fundamental in the person asking. I find I want to argue that the people who want less protection are not braver or more philosophically sophisticated. They are differently constituted. Some nervous systems process the experience of scale and indifference as annihilating and need the melodic framework to metabolize it. Others process the removal of framework as relief, as if the ordinary structured world is the source of the pressure, and the unstructured abyss is where the pressure stops. These are not the same experience. The music serves them both, but it serves them differently, and I'm not sure it is possible to fully understand one experience from inside the other. This matters for the Lovecraft question in a specific way, because one reading of why metal returned to Lovecraft so consistently is the reading that centers transgression, heavy metal as cultural space for performing relationship with what mainstream culture refuses, and Lovecraft's cosmology as the most philosophically complete version of what mainstream culture most refuses, which is the possibility that there is no center, no purpose, no final accounting in which the good are rewarded, and the structure of the universe is revealed to have been all along on the side of the human. That reading is real and partially correct, but it makes the interest in Lovecraft sound primarily oppositional, defined by what it refuses rather than what it reaches for. The other reading, which interests me more, is that something in Lovecraft's cosmology corresponds to a genuine experience that people actually have, and that very few other cultural forms give serious space to: the experience of scale, the experience of duration so vast that human history becomes invisible within it, the experience of being, briefly and without consolation, aware of exactly how small the entire enterprise of being human is against the backdrop of what actually exists. This experience is not pathological. It is not depression or nihilism or a symptom of something that needs to be corrected. It is the experience of accurate proportion. It is what happens when the cognitive defenses that keep us functional, the ones that make our own lives feel significant, our own problems feel large, our own moment feel like the center of something, briefly fail, or are deliberately dismantled, and we perceive at a level closer to the actual ratio. Most of culture is in the business of rebuilding those defenses, of reassuring us that we matter, that our suffering is meaningful, that the story has a shape that makes the suffering legible. Religion does this. Psychotherapy does this. Most popular music does this at the level of pure structural pleasure. The return of the chorus is a promise that things return, that the world has recognizable shapes, that you can find your way back. Even tragedy does this in Aristotle's reading. Catharsis as emotional purging that leaves you cleaner and more capable of re-entering the world. Lovecraftian metal, at its most philosophically serious, does something different. It does not rebuild the defenses. It holds them down for the duration of the record, and asks what you find when they are gone. What most people find, the evidence suggests, is not despair. Despair would drive people away from the music. People return to it. What they seem to find, returning again and again to the enormous indifferent sound, is something more like what certain meditation traditions describe as the relief of ego dissolution, the pressure of being a self that has to justify itself, maintain itself, protect its significance against the constant threat of evidence to the contrary. That pressure lifting, briefly, because the music has made the self too small to maintain. This is not Lovecraft's own reading of his cosmology. Lovecraft experienced the indifference of the cosmos as pure terror. He did not find relief in it. He found in it confirmation of his deepest anxieties. The music, in taking his architecture and reoccupying it with a different affect, has done something philosophically interesting that Lovecraft never intended. It has made the same structure that produced horror in him produce something more ambiguous in millions of listeners. The same cosmic scale, the same indifferent entities, a different relationship to what it means to be small inside it. Whether that different relationship is earned or whether it is a form of aestheticization that domesticates something that should remain dangerous, that is the question I cannot settle, because there is an argument that making the abyss beautiful is a betrayal of the abyss. That the specific horror Lovecraft articulated, the genuine philosophical radicalism of a cosmos with no moral structure, loses something essential when it becomes the occasion for aesthetic experience, when it becomes, however intensely, pleasurable. That the pleasure reveals we have not actually absorbed the claim, that if we had truly internalized the indifference of the universe, the appropriate response would be silence or paralysis, not the building of elaborate sonic cathedrals in honor of the void. But I keep coming back to the cathedrals, because human beings have always built the most elaborate, the most consuming, the most technically demanding things they know how to build, in response to exactly what they most cannot bear. The medieval cathedral was built toward a God whose existence was, for its builders, a source not of comfort, but of terror, infinite justice, eternal consequence, the permanent surveillance of an omniscience that nothing escaped. The response to that terror was not silence. It was Chartres. It was the flying buttress and the rose window and the acoustic engineering that makes a single voice fill a volume of space that dwarfs everything around it. Heavy metal built its own version of Chartres, with different materials, different scales, different social conditions, different theology, or anti-theology, or post-theology, or whatever the right word is for a cosmology that has gods, but gods that do not care. The impulse seems consistent across the distance. When humans encounter something that exceeds their comprehension and threatens their significance, a certain subset of them responds not by looking away, but by making something, by translating the overwhelming into the crafted, by taking the thing that unmakes them and making it, without reducing it or solving it, into a form that can be inhabited. I do not know if this is courage or avoidance. I am genuinely unsure whether the aesthetic transformation of the abyss into music you can choose to enter and leave is a form of confrontation or a form of inoculation, small doses of the void to prevent the full infection. Maybe both, maybe the same act. What I do know is that the moment I described at the beginning, inside the sound, the room gone, the boundary between body and music gone, the edge of the high place, that moment keeps happening to people, keeps being sought, keeps being built toward by musicians who could make easier music and choose not to, for audiences who could listen to something more comfortable and choose not to. Something is being reached for, something real, something that everyday life, in its necessary smallness, cannot provide. Whether the thing being reached for is wisdom or just the endorphin structure of controlled fear, I leave to someone who has more certainty than I do. What I cannot leave is the question underneath it, the one the music keeps asking without answering, the one that follows you out of the concert and stays past the ringing in your ears. If you have stood inside the sound of your own insignificance and found it, against all reason, something you wanted to return to, what does that tell you about what you are actually looking for when you call something beautiful?